Well, hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Dan Levin, and this is Essential Questions. When I was a teenager, my heart fell in love with someone. At least I thought it was love, but I wasn't sure. So I went to the smartest person I knew. I went to my father, and I said, "Dad, how am I going to know I'm in love?" And he kind of laughed at me, and he said, "You'll know." And I said, "Well, that's a terrible answer. How will I know? There must be some way to know." He said, "Trust me, you'll know." And then later on, when I met my wife, Amy, I was living in Israel, and I actually called him, and I said, "I know." But I didn't really know. And then I remember on my wedding day, it was the first time I ever shed tears of joy. It was a depth of feeling I had never really known. But I didn't really know. And then my son was born. And this is a story I love to tell. He was a little boy, and he was learning how to walk. And he wasn't really good at it. And there's a terrible sound that a small boy makes when he falls on a Florida tile floor. It's sort of a mix between a thud and a thwack. And he would fall, boom, and I'd go, ouch. And I remember how amazing that was, that like he would fall and it would hurt me, that I could actually feel that pain. And he would cry, and I would cry, pick him up, make him feel better. Sometimes he'd fall, and I'd go, ouch, and he'd go, like it hurt me more than it hurt him. And I started to realize that love is an amazingly powerful force because you feel so connected to someone else that you can literally feel what they feel. That what happens to them happens to you. And I have been fascinated with the spiritual quality of what is love, I think, probably since I was that confused 15-year-old boy trying to understand what it was to be in love. I was fascinated by the writings and the teachings of Martin Buber, who posited this idea of ways in which we connect with the world, that you can connect with the world in an I-it way, the way we might connect to a chair or to an object, and that more often than not, we kind of connect to human beings that way too, through their form or their function, but that there was a way of connecting to someone's essence where if they were willing to be open enough to you and you willing to be open enough to them, you could create a bond that was so profound that it would transform your life. And that Martin Buber taught that I-you connection gives you a glimpse into a force that can't be an it, that is in many ways all love. And so I've been fascinated with the whole idea of what is love and what is the spirituality of love and how does love influence and shape our lives. And there is no one that I would love to engage a conversation about what's love all about than Rabbi Shai Held. Shai Held is our amazing guest today. He is a philosopher, a theologian, a Bible scholar. He's president and dean at Mechon Hadar, an institute for prayer, personal growth, and Jewish study, which he co-founded in 2006. Rabbi Held is a recipient of the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education, has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America, and in the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. He's the author of several amazing books, Abraham Joshua Heschel's Call of Transcendence, The Heart of Torah, which is a commentary on the weekly Torah portion. But most recently, he published a book called Judaism is About Love. And he is also the host of his own podcast from Hadar called Answers Withheld, which I thought was a great double entendre. And I've been blessed to know Shai for many, many years, and I'm so grateful for him being with us on Essential Questions today. Shai, so great to see you.
Thank you for having me, Dan.
So there's just so much I would love to talk with you about today. But in your book, you mention and you talk at the beginning about how love is a word that we throw around in so many different contexts. It makes it almost devoid of meaning. But as someone who has delved so deeply into the study of love, can you define it? Like when someone asks you, what is love? What do you say?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really great question. And obviously, I think it depends what context they ask in. But I'll say, in the context of talking about spirituality, living a spiritual life, I find it helpful to start by saying that love is not simply an emotion. It has emotional dimensions, but love is more like an orientation, a way of holding ourselves in the world. The term that I came up with in writing the book that I find sort of almost absurdly pretentious, but that really helped me in my own thinking, love is an existential posture. It's about how I comport myself. If you like the language of philosophy, you can say love is a disposition to feel certain things and act in certain ways. Now, if a disposition doesn't manifest in emotion, at least some of the time, then you will lose the disposition, or maybe you already have. But a disposition is not simply an emotion. And I think that's important to say because you can't build a spiritual life on an emotion because emotions come and go. If I tell you that the spiritual life is built on the feeling of love, then I can have a spiritual life at 10 a.m. and not have one at 10:02 because emotions kind of ebb and flow. That's what they do. So instead, I think it makes sense to talk about love as, again, a posture or a disposition. So what I can be feeling right now is tired or grumpy, and yet my orientation is around love. I think one of the dangers that people fall into when they talk about spirituality and love is that if you tell people that they have to feel love, or for that matter, feel anything else all the time, you are inviting them to do one of two things. Either we start to lie to ourselves and we tell ourselves we feel things that we don't, and we deny feelings that we do have, which is always dangerous, or we give up. And instead, I think we have to talk in a way that is both more daunting, but also more realistic, which is that love is a way we orient ourselves in the world. I'll give you one other example, if I could, which is, I think a very interesting parallel to this is gratitude. Years ago, it's kind of a long story why, and it, is a bizarre picture into my own life, but I ordered to the library every self-help book on gratitude that I could find that had been published in the previous 25 years. It was like a wheelbarrow full of books. And I spent a day in the library just kind of like turning pages, reading the introductions. And what I found really kind of bewildering is that, a solid chunk of these books were about how you should try to feel grateful all the time. And that struck me actually as like deeply wrongheaded. 5 minutes after, God forbid, I get a cancer diagnosis, or 3 hours after my spouse dies, or my child dies, or whatever it might be. Am I supposed to be feeling gratitude? The main thing I'm feeling is grief or fear or anxiety. But the point is, I think the profound point about spirituality is that I can be feeling grief or fear and still be oriented around gratitude, still be oriented around love. So love is a way we orient ourselves towards the world and in the world.
I think about that because, as a kid, I used to hear my mom say all the time, I love you, but I don't like you very much right now. I used to think that was just so absurd until I started saying it to my own children from time to time, right? Um, and, when you talk about love as a posture, how do you take that posture? I'm blessed as a congregational rabbi to be invited into a lot of people's living rooms and into the stories of a lot of their loved ones' lives when they are summing up. And they'll talk about how their father was such a loving person. And I think that that resonates very much to the kinds of idea that you were describing, this idea that it was a posture. I can't imagine that he was always feeling love all the time. Can't imagine that he didn't have moments of anger or resentment or all the other normal things that go on in a human soul. But when they talk about a person as being a loving person, I think you're right. I think that's kind of like the posture they take. How does a person take a posture of love? What does that require? What does it mean for me to take that posture?
Yeah, I find that to be such a kind of fundamental, important, and challenging question, honestly. I think an interesting place to start is something that Maimonides picks up from Aristotle. Aristotle says this, and then it kind of pervades the history of medieval religious thought in general, which is that we can engage in cultivating feelings. I can't decide, or cultivating a posture. I can't decide. I can't see you, Dan, in the middle of the street and say, I'm going to decide to feel compassion for what you're going through right now. But 1,000,001 decisions I have made heading into this moment can make it more or less likely that I will respond to you with compassion. That is to say, I can help myself grow in certain ways. For Aristotle, that was about developing habits, right? It's about giving to people with the thought and the feeling, I want to be able to give wholeheartedly. It's about responding in a way that aspires to make this part of my personality. I think we as moderns might also talk about other things. I mean, without kind of succumbing to a certain kind of overly self-help obsessed culture, I think therapy can be crucial in developing a posture of love, in the sense of getting to work on the parts of us that are wounded or damaged and therefore feel stuck and unable to be loving. Meditation, prayer, there are all kinds of things that we can do, but I think we have to consciously be working on an attempt to kind of cultivate a certain way of living. I should say, because this is maybe relevant actually, that I think Aristotle has often been misunderstood on this point, which is that people have sometimes thought he means, okay, well, if you just kind of fake it, you'll eventually make it. I don't think that's what he's saying. It's not automatic. You have to, as it were, fake it, but with the hope and the intention that crack open my heart. I'll give you an example of this that is not the most shining example in my own life, because I really struggled with this, but I spent years as a volunteer in an Alzheimer's unit. I kept hoping naively that if I just did it long enough, it would make me less anxious. Or I should say, I would do it less fearfully and more wholeheartedly and less ambivalently. And it took me a long time to realize, Shai, if you just go through the motions and do this each week, you're just going to habituate yourself into doing this begrudgingly. You actually have to consciously think about, how can I open my heart to this more and more, right? And that's a big part of the work, I think.
Yeah, I think that opening your heart is the key, and that's something that we can direct.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, in our culture that is kind of enamored with the idea of spontaneous romantic love, that something's going to happen and, the fireworks are going to go off. I'm going to meet someone, I'm going to have chemistry with them. I think we neglect the idea that this is a muscle that we have to work as much as any other muscle. The capacity to be open, to be grateful, to be compassionate, to allow ourselves the depth of care to be able to feel what someone else feels. I remember thinking when I was beginning to study Judaism in a more sophisticated way that there's this amazing concept in Torah where we're commanded to love. Wouldn't that have been cool in high school? Right? Like if I could have gone up to, the people that I had a crush on and be like, I command you to love me. My whole years in high school would have been different if that works, but, that didn't work. But at the same time, the Torah seems to say, well, yeah, you can. The Torah, as you note, says that you have to love in a variety of different contexts. You have to love your neighbor as yourself. You have to love the stranger. You have to love the Holy One. If you came to our synagogue, Shai, as soon as you walked in the front door, you would see 3 tapestries that express these 3 commandments in various different ways. Because I think that commandment to love is really at the base of what it is to live not just a Jewish life, but a holy life. How does one try to adhere to the commandment to love the self? How do I love myself? Can I push myself to do that? What do I have to do to fulfill that commandment?
Interestingly, I don't think the Bible thinks there's a commandment to love ourselves, because the kind of love that it imagines we have to have for our neighbor, it imagines we already have for ourselves. That may be naive, but I think the Bible assumes that. In other words, love your neighbor as yourself is not 2 commandments, it's 1. It's love your neighbor the way you already love yourself. And at least according to the interpretation of Nachmanides, Ramban, that I kind of try to follow in this book, that means sort of wanting other people to have the things that I want for myself. Now, I think we know that one of the things that keeps us from wanting good for others is that many of us are mired in a pit of self-disdain, self-loathing, whatever it might be. I think for me, something that has become an important practice, even though I recognize there are people for whom this might sound like Martian, at least at the beginning, is when I am tempted to sort of succumb to a pit of kind of despair about myself, I try to imagine, wait a minute, God loves me. Am I really permitted to hate what God loves? One of the reasons you're not allowed to hate other humans is because you can't hate what God loves. Well, that means you can't hate yourself either. And one of the aspirations, I think, of a religious life is to begin to see yourself and other people, as much as it's possible as a human being, through God's eyes, as it were. That is, generously, lovingly. I'll mention here that something I found really helpful as I kind of got to the end of working on this book, just somehow began to resonate more and more deeply with me. The idea of love as a way of seeing. It's not just a way of feeling, it's not just a way of doing, it's a way of seeing other people. When I see you, do I fundamentally see a list of my grievances? Do I see, oh, look at that guy, let me tell you about his 14 biggest shortcomings? Or do I see an incredibly precious, totally unique, infinitely valuable image of God? And what does it mean to cultivate a certain way of seeing? I think the same thing applies to how we see ourselves. It is so tempting in our culture, I think, to swing between I'm the greatest thing in the world and I'm worthless, and actually to get to the point of realizing, actually, I'm neither. What I am is an infinitely precious image of God. God loves me no matter what I do. God has expectations of me, but God's love is not conditional. And what would it mean to begin to see myself that way?
So I love that idea of using love as a lens through which you see, to cultivate in yourself this capacity to look at the other person through a lens of gratitude and awe and wonder and curiosity, as opposed to through a lens of judgment or resentment or condemnation. I think that has so much potential for enriching the quality of human life. I think about love as that exercise of care, caring enough about yourself that you can feel what you feel. Because how am I going to be able to feel what somebody else feels if I can't feel what I feel? I think about how much we do in our natural American life to numb ourselves to our own experience. How prevalent is the culture of the use of alcohol or drugs or other kinds of things to numb ourselves, because we don't want to feel anxiety. We don't want to feel shame. We don't want to feel less than or disappointment. We want to feel good all the time. In America, we have this really weird thing where you have to be happy all the time. You go up to somebody, how are you? I'm good. Well, what if you're not good? What do you say? Okay. How sad is it in our culture that the natural response to feeling bad is, I can't actually say that. I have to be good all the time. And if I have to be good all the time, then that's not an actual honest response. And so if I'm not allowed to feel what I feel, how am I possibly going to be able to feel what somebody else feels?
I think that the Jewish thinker who most dramatically gropes for what you're talking about is the Hasidic master Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who makes a distinction that I have always found really exceptionally moving and just helpful in my own life, between what he calls atzvut on the one hand, atzvut we might translate as depression, and shvirat halev, brokenheartedness, on the other. And he says this really counterintuitive thing, which is that brokenheartedness is the opposite of depression. I'm not sure about this, but I think what he means by that is one of the things that leads to depression is that when I'm so overwhelmed by what I'm feeling that I can't feel it at all. I can't feel it anymore. And he talks about, in this really interesting way, how breaking open our heart paradoxically leads to really deep joy. The example of that I think about, honestly, in my own life is if you've ever had the experience of being desperate to cry about something and finally a tear comes out, and that tear is the most liberating experience in the world. It's like, I'm alive, right? And I think that's kind of what you're talking about. It's true, right? In other words, if we can't be present to ourselves, there are going to be very profound limits to how present we can be to other people. That, I think, is just a kind of a law of psychology. It's the physics of the human experience, if you will, right? You can't do it. You can't be radically open-hearted to other people and be totally shut down to yourself. It doesn't really work. It's not plausible, and it's probably not desirable either, but it's very hard work. And I think it's worth saying that. We were talking earlier about cultivating. This is a spiritual discipline, being present to oneself, being open to one's own suffering, being open to understanding why it's so hard to be open to our suffering. I mean, you have to be cautious here, right? You can't walk up to someone who's massively traumatized and say, oh, the answer for you is just to feel everything that you feel. You have to go carefully and slowly. Psychologists talk about titration, right? How much can a person be open to at one time? Real skill and attunement is necessary here. That is the path. Now, just very quickly, I just wanted to pick up on something you said earlier that I wish I had talked about more in my book. I love the language of curiosity as part of what it means to love other people. That feels exactly right to me. I had a colleague at Hadar in the early days, Rabbi Stephen Exler, who's now the rabbi of a nice Orthodox synagogue in Riverdale. He used to say part of what it means to learn in chavruta, to study with a study partner, is to develop a posture of loving curiosity and to really be receptive to another person's thoughts, to another person's feelings, to another person's experience. And that really does feel like a core dimension of love.
I think you're absolutely right. I'm struck by the resonance of that with the famous passage, quotation from Elie Wiesel, who said, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. When you lose your curiosity, right, when you lose your capacity to wonder and not care, that's where love is lost. And I think that's, frankly, where humanity is lost.
Yeah, the word that I might add to indifference there is a kind of numbness, which is what you were talking about a minute ago, where we look, I forget now exactly what language you used, turning to alcohol and drugs as a way of kind of almost, anesthetizing myself against my own experience. I mean, indifference comes with a whole bunch of cousins, I think, that together conspire to make us less loving, less compassionate, less present, frankly.
Talk a little bit, Shai, about hate. So if the opposite of love is lack of curiosity or wonder or care or numbness or indifference, hate obviously is not that. Hate is a profound expression of care. It's just in a resonance that is horrifically destructive. And we're seeing the eruptions of hate all over our world in such hideous manifestations, whether it's anti-Semitism and the other elements of hate that we're seeing in our country, or the horrific elements of hate that are erupting in the Middle East or in Sudan or in other places. What's the connection between love and hate?
That's obviously like a really powerful question, and it speaks to what is most almost degraded or degrading about human experience sometimes. I think part of it is about simply feeling really strongly in a way that is uncultivated and out of control. So let me sort of back up for a minute and say, I think part of what it means to love is to insistently see the humanity of other people. And therefore, I think part of what it means to hate, I'm not sure this is always constitutive of hate, but it's certainly part of it often, is precisely to dehumanize, to see people as less than human, to refuse to see their humanity, to see them as, and you can fill in the blanks here, and therefore to see them as unworthy of dignity, as unworthy of respect, and all that follows from that. I think also, when we go back to what we were talking about Nachmanides, Ramban earlier, about to love someone is to want what's best for them. I think to hate someone is often to want them to suffer. And that is a very base feeling, a totally understandable feeling. I think it is also part of human nature, right? I actually think it is not helpful when we encounter feelings of hate in ourselves to lie to ourselves and say, no, I don't feel that. I think it's actually really important. One of the ways we can kind of rob hate of its power is to sort of, oh, wow, wow, what I am feeling towards you right now is incredibly strong. I don't have to act on every feeling that I have, right? That's the kind of almost the basic insight of the spiritual life, right? Like I have agency here. Between the stimulation that I'm feeling and my response, I have the possibility of breathing, thinking about whether I want to react. But in some ways, I think of hate, and to the extent that I feel hate in certain situations, I really see it as the opposite of that. It's about wanting someone to have nothing. It's like, I want you to suffer. And I would say part of the work here, and this is perhaps something we could talk about at great length, although I'm not sure I have this developed in my mind at all yet, is that I think love never seeks to dominate another person. Hate very often is predicated on the desire to dominate another person. There are certain things I want to inflict on you, and no one's going to stop me. That kind of impulse. Like, I'm going to make you pay for what you did to me. I don't think love ever does that. Love sometimes exercises power, like we pull our children away from an oncoming car, or right? I mean, there are ways that love is not always, totally self-effacing. But I think hate feels to me these days like hate is tied up with a desire to both to dominate on the one hand and to dehumanize on the other. That's not a very organized answer. I still feel it's funny. Several people have said to me in the last couple of months, so would you think about your next book being about Judaism and hate, or the spirituality of managing hate? And I find that question really interesting, incredibly daunting, because it does, as you can tell from the way I answered you a minute ago, I don't think I have any particularly developed or sophisticated answer to this question yet. But that's at least where the beginning of my thinking is. I mean, is that how you think about it, or is it different? Or
I think about elements of hate as being, I think human beings have a deep-seated need to experience love. They need to feel and to experience that my life matters to somebody else. What happens to me matters to somebody else. That I'm not alone. I think loneliness is probably the most dangerous condition a human being can ever suffer. That's why I think like solitary confinement has got to be a punishment worse than death. The idea that I could exist and not a single soul would care about me. And so like when people are suffering and there's a sense that no one cares about my suffering, I think there's this, or that my suffering was imposed because of a lack of care. I think there's this sort of instinctive human need, well, I'm going to make you care, right? So for example, I think about, during the Intifada, where people were blowing themselves up in pizza restaurants, an act of such ghastly hate. And I'm thinking, where does that come from? I think in some respects it kind of comes from, well, like, we're suffering over here and you don't care. And you know what? I'm going to make you care by making you feel what I feel. So as you said, a few moments ago, I'm going to make you pay. I'm going to make you pay means I'm going to make you suffer the way I'm suffering, right? You cheated me. I'm going to cheat you back. You hurt me. I'm going to hurt you back. I'm not sure that is all that hate is. I think hate is a much more complex thing, which is why I hope someone, if not you, will do the work to try to understand the spirituality and the dynamics of that, because I think it's important to understand it. I think if we understood hate a little bit better, maybe we could figure out ways to mitigate it a little bit. Mm-hmm. But thinking about that a little bit, and maybe a different context, there is this idea in Kabbalah where chesed, loving kindness, is balanced by gevurah, or din, which is like strength or strict justice. And you wrote a chapter called Sacred Indignation, and you kind of talk a bit about protest. And we often talk about love as a virtue, unconditional love. But then you kind of think about judgment, and that doesn't sound so unconditional. I think a society that doesn't ever exercise judgment is also kind of a dangerous society too. How do you balance? What's the connection between judgment, protest, and love?
One of the things that it took me a while to realize just in my own thinking, I don't think it's helpful just juxtapose love and justice. although I think there are obviously situations where we need to do just that. The tradition is very clear that there are moments where, say, mercy and justice bump up against each other. I mean, when you think about it, when the sages of the Talmud say God is struggling on Yom Kippur over which chair to sit in, the throne of judgment or the throne of mercy, you have no better way of saying that this is a difficult tension than to say that even God finds it hard. So there really is, on some level, a juxtaposition between love and justice. But it took me a while to realize that the juxtaposition or the dialectic is not enough, because it's also the case that justice depends on love. A lot of times what drives people to struggle for a more just world is loving the world and loving people within it. And what makes people able to make themselves heard in the pursuit of justice is having been loved in the first place. I argue in this book, I know there are people who will not go along with me on this point, but I think that in Jewish sources, love is prior to justice. Famous midrash, which imagines that, love wants human beings to be created. I'm sort of simplifying a little bit, and love says create human beings, truth says don't, and God takes truth and tosses it out of heaven, right? As if to say, I'm choosing love. When it's a struggle between love and justice, I choose love. But that does not ever mean I'm tossing out justice. What Kabbalah, I think, is getting at, that I probably in retrospect should have talked about more in my book, is that when your discourse is entirely about love, you run the risk of a culture where anything goes and there are no consequences. I tried to talk about this in the context of divine anger, trying to make sense of biblical passages where God gets angry, which is about saying love is not a blank check. When I love someone, I have expectations of them. In fact, the more I love them, the more I have expectations of them, which is part of how I think about covenant as a biblical idea. God doesn't give people commandments because God disrespects us. God gives us commandments because God respects us as agents and wants us to be God's partners in constructing a kind of world that God wants to be in. I think this is a complicated walk we have to do between love and justice. And I'll just say, almost in an absurd way, my book is somewhat lengthy. At one point, my editor said to me, Shai, every 50 pages that you add from now on, there is an inverse proportion in terms of the number of people who actually read the book. And the example he gave, which was very funny, was Bill Clinton's autobiography. It's like, that thing is 970 pages. Lots of people bought it. I can tell you in the book publishing industry, everybody knows nobody read it. I'm saying this because I had a chapter I was working on the relationship between love and law, and another chapter I was working on the relationship between love and justice. And those remain kind of undeveloped files on my computer. But you're right that, they ended up getting cut. But you're right that protest is the place where I tried to play that out. I wanted to play around with this really not obvious idea that part of what it means for God to take us seriously is to want us to actively develop our voice and our ability to say, this cannot be.
You mention also in a different part this wonderful midrash from Genesis Rabbah, where a person comes across a palace that is doleket, right, which can be translated either as full of light or all aflame. And the person asks, is it possible that there's this palace and there's no one to look after it? And then the owner of the building looks out and says, no, I'm the owner of the palace. And you said that Abraham is kind of, the Midrash, I should say, says that Abraham's kind of the same. Is it possible that this world has no one who looks after it? And the Holy One replies, I'm the owner of the world. So one way you can look at that is you look at the world and it's all glitter and glory. And how awesome is it that God created this for us? But I remember learning this midrash and thinking God calls out from this burning palace and says, yeah, it's mine, but you can't put the fire out from inside. Someone needs to come and put out the fire. I think that there's some element of love that demands response, that demands action, and that compels someone not just to feel a mushy feeling towards somebody, but to actually take responsibility for what is that person's condition. When you think about that midrash, what does that midrash teach you about love?
I mean, just to pick up for a second on what you just said, you might even say in traditional language that love is a commanding force, right? There's a way in which love issues imperatives. When I love someone, exactly as you said, it's not just a gushy feeling. It's like, oh, this child needs me. This person in front of me needs me to care for them. Love kind of makes claims. It issues commands in some very deep way.
I think actually love, the way that you describe love is actually the most authentic commanding voice there is. The voice that comes from the outside that says you shall not, you have to, you shouldn't, and all that is much harder to listen to authentically than the voice that wells up from within from a place of love that says you have to or you can't. I find that to be resonant in Torah too. Keep going. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
no, I think that's interesting. I mean, there's a lot to talk about here about the relationship between conscience and revelation. And what are the ways in which God speaks within us and not just to us, right? And how we might, as modern Jews, wrestle with that idea. But to go back to your question about how I hear this midrash, I mean, I do think there's something really almost breathtaking about the idea that the founder of the Jewish people is someone whom God meets precisely in the moment when he says, the world as it is just nothing like the world as it's intended to be. How does he know that? And what gives him the courage to stand up and say, it's not supposed to be this way? Why not just go along to get along? Why not conformity? And there's this wonderful midrash about, the meaning of the word Ivri or Hebrew, right? Is that the whole world is on one side and Abraham is on the other, and he's still willing to stand his ground and speak up when he needs to. I just find that image of, a Jew as someone who will not tolerate the status quo when it's intolerable to be really daunting, challenging, moving. I mean, all of those things. And again, I'm just fascinated by the idea that the rabbis construct this Abraham. What are the character traits that you're looking for in the founder of your religion and the founder of your people? And the idea that one of them is that he's a protester is just fascinating. And I'll say, by the way, the same thing happens with Moses. The rabbis pick up on something really striking about Moshe, which is, as you will recall, when God gets incredibly angry in the wake of the golden calf incident, what God says to Moshe is fascinating. God says, let go of me, or let me be, hanichali, let me be, and I will destroy them. And the thing that's so odd is Moshe hasn't said anything. So why is God saying, let me be? And it's almost like God is sort of saying to Moshe, I want you to be the kind of person who stands up even to me. I want you to be the kind of person who exercises agency even in the face of God, right? That's not obvious. You could imagine a piety that says, in the face of God, the only thing there is to do ever is surrender. And there is place for surrender in the religious life. But really interestingly, neither Abraham nor Moses in these moments is a model of surrender. They're a model of something very different. The model of audacity and a certain kind of humble self-confidence, which is a kind of paradox, right? And that I just find that to be a really challenging thing to think about. Also, what is Jewish education if we're teaching our communities to be B'nai Avraham, right? To be children of Abraham. That means we can't be conformists. We can't just go along to get along. That's powerful stuff. And also, as I was saying, really daunting. That's hard work.
What I love about our liturgy is how we equate instruction and guidance and commandment as acts of love. There's this equation that you have in the evening service. Ahavat olam beit Yisrael amcha ahavta, right? You have loved the Jewish people with an eternal love. Torah, mitzvah, chukim u'mishpetun, otanu limadata. Torah and mitzvahs, laws and precepts have you taught us. It's like one equals the other. And in so many ways, that is kind of a bit of what love is also, right? I remember learning that when parents were bringing their children to the train platform in Prague during the kinder transport, and you have this last moment to talk to your children before they go away, and God knows if you'll ever see them again. And what did the kids say their parents told them? Well, some of them said, my mom and dad said, I love you. And a lot of them spent a lot of time telling them what to do, right? Look after your brother. Be nice to the people who took you in. Don't forget who you are. Brush your teeth. Whatever it was that they told them, right? That's how you express love in Jewish language, is by telling people what to do. And I think sometimes the most loving thing that a person can do is to offer tochacha, to offer judgment, to offer rebuke. Because if you really love that person and you see them walking down a destructive path, you have to kind of wave the flag and say, is that really the path you want to walk down? Don't you see how you're hurting yourself? Don't you see how you're hurting all the people around you? Don't you see that if perhaps you might follow a different path, you could be so much happier? Sometimes we think that that's not what love is. Love is, I'll be with you no matter what you do. And I think in some ways that's true too, right? To know that I'm not going to lose you. But at the same time, what I love about that moment in Exodus 33, right, where Moses is on Mount Sinai, is that there's rebuke by Moses to God. No, I'm not going to let you be. We're in relationship here. And I'm going to be there for you, and you're going to be there for me. In a few short moments, we're going to be celebrating the High Holy Days, and we're going to be given this metaphor, Avinu Malkeinu. And we're going to sing it and we're going to intone it in so many different contexts. When you think about a loving God, which you write about so eloquently in your book, how do you read that metaphor? I mean, I think one of the things that's hard for Jews is they don't think of God as this big, bald-bearded fuzzy who lives on a cloud who deals out Surus cards depending on how many times we light Shabbat candles. But when you think about God as a loving God, as a father or a parent or as a ruler using this, how do you employ that in your own practice of the Chagim?
Maybe two thoughts for now. One is that since you focus on Father, and it really flows from what you just said, I find it really helpful to remind myself constantly that God's love has expectations but not conditions. God's love is not conditional. God will love me even if I'm a sinner. If my son becomes an axe murderer, God forbid, I will love him. But I sure do have expectations. I will be incredibly disappointed if he lives a life that is, immoral, cruel, if he, turns away from the things I've tried to impart to him. So I think we often in our culture get confused in parenting between conditions and expectations. We either stop articulating expectations because we don't want to articulate conditions, or we articulate expectations in ways that make our kids feel that our love for them is conditional. What I love about the image of a God whose love is parental is that I think of God as the one who, if you will, gets that right. God will love me no matter what, but God has commands for me. God has expectations of me. God takes me seriously as an agent. And in the High Holidays context, I find that helpful because it means I can come back to God and say, I'm sorry for the ways I blew it. And Jewish theology says this really wildly audacious, almost crazy thing, which is what God says back is, I still believe in you. Keep going. Go try again. There are moments where I find that almost can reduce me to tears because it's such a contrast, certainly a wild contrast from the parenting I experienced, right? I mean, so far from what many of us are capable of giving as parents or what we received as children. So there's something there that's very powerful. Now, just very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but very quickly about the Avinu Malkeinu dialectic, the our Father, our King, I find it helpful to think about God as someone with whom I can be intimate, and yet at the same time, as someone who transcends me completely in ways that mean I can never really even understand what God is. Avinu is the God whom I live in relationship. You're describing in a certain way Moses on Mount Sinai saying to God, no, I'm going to hold you to account. That feels like my father to me. Not my father, right? That's the Avinu. The Malkeinu is, God, you're so awesome. I throw myself down on the ground in the presence of the grandeur of the world and who you are. And we don't pick between those things. God is not just some mysterious transcendent force that you can't relate to, but nor is God your next door neighbor, right? And there's something wonderful about that dialectic. God is not one or the other. God is both and so much more.
And I think that idea of thinking about God through that lens of love, but also through that lens of awe and wonderment is another piece. Last question I have for you, Shai, is what are the essential questions you ask yourself? What are the questions as you begin the new year that you're thinking you want to try to answer for yourself?
One of the questions I ask myself, or try to ask myself every year, it's not about this moment which we're talking, but it's about every moment, is where am I stuck? Where do I feel like I spend a lot of time spinning my wheels? Where I say to myself, okay, but you just had this exact conversation with yourself yesterday and the day before and the day before and the day before. Is there a way to make progress here? I do find the question, where am I stuck, really helpful, but you have to ask it. This goes right back to where we started in a way, with a spirit of enough generosity that it doesn't become an opportunity to castigate yourself, but instead an invitation to actually grow. It's very easy, I think, to succumb to, oh my God, you are so boring and tedious. You have the same struggle every year. And instead to say, well, where am I stuck? How might I become unstuck? What are the ways in which I've even given up on trying to become unstuck because I'm so busy and I'm so this and I'm so that? So that is a question that's kind of very important to me in my own religious life. Another one that I'll share, I would think there's obviously many more things we could say, but one that I think about a lot is, one of the things I talk about in this book is the idea that we receive gifts from God and the expectation is that we pass them on, what I call the gifts of God flowing through us. The image in Kabbalah is that there is a flow of divine gifts, and the goal is to keep it going rather than dam it up. One question that feels essential to me about what teshuvah or repentance is to ask, what are the forces within me that make me become a dam rather than a channel? Right? What are the ways that I end up blocking the flow of goodness in the world rather than keeping it going? That, I think, to answer those kind of questions honestly requires an almost searing amount of honesty, kind of openness to ourselves and all of our limits, and real compassion for ourselves. And that's, again, that combination of compassion for ourselves, but also expectations of ourselves.
What a beautiful thought. Rabbi Shai Held, the book is Judaism is About Love, Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life. It's published by Farrar, Straus & Giroux. You can get it everywhere. I really hope that everyone will take the opportunity to put this on your nightstand. It is a gift to your soul and your spirit to engage and to join Rabbi Held on this journey. It's so enriching. And Shai, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. The Essential Questions podcast has been made possible by the Temple Beth El Jewish Ideas Incubator, committed to creativity and innovation in modern Jewish life. Many thanks to our production team, Jason Reeser, Amanda Brentzel, and Susan Stallone. You can find this podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, and the Podbean app, as well as on Temple Beth El's website, tveboca.org/essential questions. Share this podcast with your friends. Rate us on Apple Podcast or Spotify to spread the word. And we want to know, what are your essential questions? Let us know by emailing us at eq@tveboca.org. I'm Rabbi Dan Levin, and thanks for listening to the Essential Questions podcast.